Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm Jared Ledesma, and I'm an assistant curator here at the Des Moines Arts Center, and I'm the curator of Sultry Night, selected works by Grant Wood. If you haven't seen the show, I urge you to go up to our print gallery and check it out. All of the works in the show, except for one, are from the Des Moines Arts Center's collection, and we have a great collection of works by Grant Wood. And I'm really excited tonight for our lecture by Professor Reed Anderson. Reed Anderson, PhD, is an associate professor of art history at the Kansas City Art Institute, where he teaches courses in American art, European art, and the history of printmaking. He's the author of American Etchers Abroad, 1880 to 1939, an exhibition and catalog sponsored by the Spencer Museum of Art at the University of Kansas. He is also a print collector and specializes in etchings by early 20th century American artists. Anderson is currently working on a catalog raisonné devoted to the American expatriate Herman Armour Webster, whose successful career as a printmaker, living and working in France, spanned 6 decades. So get ready for a juicy lecture. Please help me welcome Reed Anderson.
I'd like to thank Jared for inviting me here tonight, and I'd also like to thank Joe Featherstone for handling the logistics associated with my visit, and I'd like to thank all of you for being here tonight too. I'm going to start with this quote. I actually had planned to end with this quote, but after thinking about it for a couple of days, I thought it would actually serve as a much better introduction of what you're going to see in here than kind of use it to kind of wrap it all up. It comes from a book written by Jonathan Weinberg. The title of the book is Male Desire, the Homoerotic in American Art, and it was actually published in 2004. And at the beginning of the book, Jonathan Weinberg writes, and I quote, "The act of one man looking at another man's body is fraught, even when it's sanctioned by the museum or the tradition of academic training." I guess you could say I rediscovered this print about 2 years ago. I was working on a lecture for my printmaking class, history of printmaking class, on lithography. And I knew about Grant Wood's lithographs, and I started looking at them a little bit more closely, and I ended up coming across this one. And there was something about it that was familiar. I remember seeing it a long time ago, and but just kind of in glancing. And when I started looking at it more closely, I started thinking, you know, this seems very sophisticated for 1937. I don't recall seeing anything quite like this from that time period, or really before. And so anyway, I started researching it. I started looking into it a little bit more. And I found out about the controversy that arose when it actually was published in 1937. It was actually published by a group, well, an organization actually, called the Associated American Artists. And the job of the Associated American Artists, they I guess you could say, contracted with well-known artists of the time to create lithographic prints that they could market to a middle-class audience for about $5 or less. And so when this print was actually one of the very first, it was one of the 5 first lithographs that Grant Wood actually did for Associated American Artists, which he would do another, 14 over the next 5 years. Anyway, when this print was released in 1937, it drew a lot of attention very quickly. And the U.S. Postmaster in New York actually condemned this work. He actually called it pornography. He claimed that it was actually pornographic. And because it was pornographic, he would not allow it the advertising for the print to actually be, let's say, mailed through the U.S. mail, or sales of the print couldn't be conducted through the U.S. mail. And when Associated American Artists actually found out about the, I guess you could say, censorship instituted by the U.S. Postal Service, they actually reduced the edition of this print. It was their normal practice to issue these prints in an edition of 250. And with the controversy that rose up around the print, they actually reduced that edition to 100, making this actually, I think, probably one of Grant Wood's rarest prints. And before I forget to mention it, I think it's kind of an important little detail that it is a print. It's a lithograph. And prints are supposed to be experienced differently than paintings and sculpture and architecture and other examples of fine art. A print is something that's supposed to be held in your hands. Your experience with a print, your experience with looking at a print is supposed to be much more intimate than looking at a painting hanging on a wall or looking at a piece of sculpture on a pedestal or something like that. And I think that's kind of an important little detail, that sense of intimacy that comes with looking at prints and experiencing prints as works of art. Like I said, this print actually drew a lot of controversy, and it drew a lot of controversy simply because it depicted a nude male, and a frontal nude male, actually taking a bath. While I was actually preparing this lecture, I came across an exhibition review written by a man by the name of Sam Rigby. And Sam Rigby actually writes for the BBC network. And he was actually reviewing an exhibition that was actually sponsored by the Tate Museum in London, or let's say a couple years ago, titled The Nude. And in his review of that exhibition, which was actually titled Why the Nude Still Shocks, Sam Rigby actually comes to, I guess you could say, the conclusion that the nude still shocks even today because it's art that's actually about us. And the more realistic that art is, the more realistic that nude is, the more controversial that nude is actually going to be. And I think that's kind of an important little detail about this particular print here, is how realistic the man is depicted. If you look at the landscape, or if you look at the composition in general, if you look at the trees, they strike me as just a tad bit stylized. And if you look at the horse trough looks a little bit streamlined and therefore a little bit stylized as well. But if you look at the man and the way that he's depicted with an extreme amount of realism, I think. And because of that extreme realism, again, the nude, I think, is actually going to be a little bit more controversial than it would be otherwise. If you haven't had a chance to visit the exhibition upstairs, I would encourage you to do that and take a look at the figures that appear, the human figures that actually appear in the other prints. If you look at those human figures that appear in the other prints, their bodies, again, are going to be just a little bit abstract, but they're going to be just a little bit stylized. And they're going to be really radically different from the man that you see here. The picture that we see here is, again, it's an image of a man in an open landscape. It looks to me like maybe a plowed field or a field that's actually been cleaned. Looks to me like maybe corn or something like that that's already been harvested. Anyway, he's out in an open landscape underneath some moonlight. The moonlight is actually hitting his body and illuminating his body. And again, that sense of realism, I think, shows up particularly well in the tan lines that you can actually see on his arms, and the tan line actually around his neck, around his chest, and also on his face. And the moonlight, the way it actually hits his body, it kind of accentuates those tan lines, and at the same time, kind of, I guess you could say, draws our attention to his lower abdomen, his lower part of his body, and really how unidealized that body is. The fact that it is so unidealized is another thing that actually makes this figure just a little bit too realistic. And another thing that Wood does here that he hadn't ever done before, he'd actually depicted the nude on several occasions, and nude men on several occasions. On those occasions, he had done something to, I guess you could say, obscure the male genitals. He had veiled them in some way. And he doesn't do that here. He doesn't do that at all. I mean, if you look really closely, you can see that the moonlight even illuminates this man's penis, and it's an uncircumcised penis. That's another little important detail there. You see his uncircumcised penis and his scrotum, and all of that actually framed with that rather thick patch of pubic hair. Anyway, he's taken that bucket, he's dipped it into the trough, the horse trough, and he's lifting it up over his head, fully exposing his body to the viewer. And again, kind of calling the viewer's attention to the male nude. According to Grant Wood, this print was actually based on childhood memories. He claimed that when he was a young boy, he would remember going out into the farmyard and seeing the farmhands do exactly what this man is doing here. His sister even claimed, well, she was always one to actually back him up when any kind of controversy arose. Anyway, his sister Nan actually backed him up and said that was exactly the truth. On hot, summer, sultry nights, the farmhands would actually go out to the horse trough. They'd dip a pail down into the water and pour the water all over themselves in an effort to kind of cool off, take a bath before they actually went to bed in the evening. That leads me to this book here. This was actually written by Emmanuel Cooper. And this book actually was something of a landmark when it was published in 1986. Its title is The Sexual Perspective, Homosexuality in Art in the Last 100 Years in the West. Emmanuel Cooper actually began his career as a ceramicist. He's from England, and a well-known ceramicist. He actually wrote quite a few books on ceramics and the history of ceramics. And then in the early to mid 1970s, he became involved in he became a gay activist and became involved in gay rights. And in 1986, again, decided to create this book, or write this book, titled The Sexual Perspective. And what he's done here is actually gone back and looked at the history of art over the last 100 years and focused specifically on gay men and women and the artwork that they actually produced over that 100 years. Anyway, a very important little detail in the book is that Cooper claims that gay men and women have been drawn to the arts as a vocation, as a profession. And one of the reasons that gay men and women have been drawn to the arts as a profession is because of the, what do you want to say? What's the word I'm looking for here? Acceptance. The acceptance that they find and the support that they find in that profession in, I guess you could say, talking about their sexual identity and the work that they produce. They find a lot of support with the other in that profession. And according to Emmanuel Cooper, artists have, gay artists, both men and women, have tended to focus on particular subject matter as a way of kind of expressing their sexual identity, and they've actually coded that imagery that they make in such a way that it would actually be understood by a small segment of the population who is sensitive to the themes that they are depicting in the work that they produce. It's a very important book, and if you haven't had a chance to read it, granted it's about 30 years old right now, and so it's a little bit outdated. It actually should be updated, but it's still a very important book in regards to sexual identity, particularly the homosexual identity in art over the last 100 years. According to Emmanuel Cooper, one of the areas that gay men have, or let's say one of the subjects that gay men have been drawn to, is the bath. And because the bath is an opportunity, again, it provides the artist with an opportunity to express their sexual identity, but again, doing so in a rather coded way, in a way that maybe won't be understood by the majority of viewers, but still will be understood by those who are sensitive to the theme. And one of the earliest depictions, actually, of a male bathhouse is this one actually by Albrecht Dürer. And I should point out real quickly, before I move on, that images of men bathing are extremely rare in the history of art, extremely rare. When you compare them to the images of women bathing, which are actually quite ubiquitous. But images of male bathing are actually quite rare. And they're actually broken up into two different groups. There's a group of men bathing together, and there's another group of men bathing alone. And the images of men bathing alone are actually even rarer than the images of men bathing together. And another important little detail is when you look at these images, you have to pay attention to the fact that women are excluded. You don't see any reference to women in the works. So that raises, in my opinion, some questions as far as who the target audience is for this imagery. Anyway, one of the earliest images of men bathing together is actually this one by Albrecht Dürer, a German Renaissance artist. It's a woodcut. I should mention that too. And actually much smaller than what you see on the screen here. It's maybe about 6-7 inches tall, maybe about 3-4 inches wide. And Dürer was actually a master when it came to the woodcut. And I think this is actually a very good example of that. And it's one of those woodcuts and one of those prints by Durer that I think is actually riddled with all type of homoerotic references here. I'd like to begin actually with the figure outside of the bathhouse. If you look right here, you can actually see a man outside of the bathhouse who's actually gazing into the bathhouse with something like a wistful look on his face. And he's there for a reason. He's there to actually remind the viewer of where they are. I mean, the viewer is doing exactly what that man is doing. We're just occupying a different place in the composition, outside the picture plane. Anyway, this man here is reminding us that we're a voyeur much as he is. Anyway, the men inside the bathhouse, how many of them are there? There's 6 of them here. Oh, wrong direction. 6 of them. You can see that one of them here is actually playing a flute, and the other one here is actually playing a violin. And the man playing the flute, is actually a Renaissance symbol. It goes way back to the Renaissance, and it's actually a symbol for sexual play. And so that right there alludes to the fact that there's some type of sexual content, let's put it that way, sexual content actually to this print. If you look at the men, they're for the most part nude. The only part of them that appears to be covered is actually their genitals. Anyway, this man here, who's actually resting on the faucet, notice where the faucet is placed. The faucet is placed right at his crotch, right? And so it ends up being a symbol for the phallus, or it is a symbol of the phallus. And if you look at that phallus just a little bit closer, or the faucet just a little bit closer, you can see that the handle for turning on the faucet is in the image of what appears to be a rooster, a cock, which is an old symbol, very, very old symbol for the phallus. It goes way, way back in the history of art. And then if you look at these 2 men here in the foreground, well, let me back up just a little bit. If you look at the man actually here with the faucet, standing near the faucet, he's looking directly at the man who's actually playing the flute. And the man playing the flute is returning his gaze. And if you look down here, you can see 2 men. One of them appears to be holding a comb or a brush or some type of implement. And this figure here looks to be holding some type of a flower, which seems completely out of place, but nevertheless, that's the best that I can do with it. But nevertheless, the 2 figures, these 2 male figures, are looking into each other's eyes, and looking into each other's eyes intently, suggesting to me that, again, there's a sense of intimacy or suggested intimacy between these 2 figures just as there are between these 2 figures here. In the 19th century, artists that wanted or chose to depict men bathing decided to abandon the bathhouse and situate their men out in a landscape, a sun-drenched landscape, near a body of water, the men bathing. And if you really stop and think about it, this was actually a very typical pastime during the 19th century, both in Europe and in the United States, as you'll see here in just a moment. Scenes of men skinny dipping or bathing in the nude were really not that rare. I mean, that was kind of common behavior at that particular time. Anyway, this work was actually done by a French artist, a 19th century French artist, a man by the name of Frédéric Bazille, who died at the age of 28. He ended up becoming involved in the Franco-Prussian War and lost his life very early in that battle. Anyway, this work here, titled Summer Scene, in parentheses, Bathers, was painted in 1969. And Bazille actually submitted this work to the Salon of 1870. And the critics at the Salon were kind of divided in regards to the merits of the painting. A few critics described it as having a sense of freshness to it, a sense of sincerity to it that they actually liked quite a lot. But then others were not quite so laudatory in their praise. They tended to find things problematic about it. Some critics were actually taken aback by the way the background was painted. They thought it was painted just a little bit too loose. They didn't like the way the figures were actually disposed throughout the landscape. which I think is actually a very good critique of it. They just found other things that they didn't particularly care for. And the subject matter, I think, is probably what bothered them the most. Anyway, if you look at the composition, you can see that Basile, and I should mention that this painting is actually preceded by many, many studies. Basile created quite a few studies in preparation for this work. Nevertheless, the way he's actually composed this painting here, he's actually kind of dispersed the figure throughout the landscape in a rather symmetrical way. I mean, if you kind of divide the canvas in half, again, the way the figures are disposed or placed in the landscape, again, he's done so in a rather symmetrical way. And that's one of the problems with the painting, I think, is that in doing so, he's kind of forsaken any sense of connection between the figures. The figures all seem to be rather isolated in the landscape. They kind of take us from the foreground to the middle ground to the background, and once you get into the background, you can actually see one figure at the far right over here who appears to be undressing, so he can actually join his colleagues for a little dip in the water. They're actually, the body of water that they're actually swimming in is actually the Lez River, L-E-Z, which was actually near Montpellier, where Basile actually was born and raised. And Basile actually started out his career as a doctor, a medical doctor. That's what his family had more or less, the profession his family more or less had steered him into. And it was while he was actually studying to become a medical doctor that he was actually introduced to some artists who were working at that time, people like Claude Monet. And Basile decided he wanted to give up his studies in medicine in order to pursue his career as a painter. But his parents actually forbid that. They said that there was no way that they were going to support their son while he studied to become a painter. And so they made a deal with him. They said, if you continue to practice medicine, we'll help support you while you endeavor to become a painter. Support his career as a painter, too, as long as he kept practicing medicine. Anyway, back to the composition. He borrows too much from antiquity here. That's one of the things I think is actually wrong with the image. If you look at this figure here, he looks to me like he was actually taken from an illustration by Marc Antonio Raimondi, an illustration of Raphael's tapestry titled The Judgment of Paris. He's a depiction of a river god. He looks very much like a river god, a Roman river god. And if you look at the figure up here in the foreground, leaning up against the tree, he's very reminiscent of images of Saint Sebastian actually undergoing his martyrdom. And so Basile here has actually put together, I think, a fairly successful composition, but one that I think relies just a little bit too much on antiquity, and particularly and a little bit too much on the tradition of art. Again, he's borrowing from other artists. And in so doing, again, I think kind of tampering down just maybe a little bit of the eroticism that this work might have. When Basile was actually working on this painting, he was actually writing letters to his friends and family and complaining about the fact that the jurors at the salon didn't want his nude men. The jurors at the salon were all too happy to take his images of nude women, but when it came to depictions of nude men, that was a whole different story. He'd actually submitted this work to the Salon of 1868, Fisherman with a Net. And this work was actually rejected by the Salon. They didn't want to have any part of this work. And like I said, Basile actually voiced his frustrations to his family and friends time and time again. And when he described this work to his friends and his family, he described it as my nude men or my bathers. That's the way he actually described it. That's the way he talked about it. But like I said, he found that the jurors of the Salon, and I would say the general population of France at that time, the salon-goers of France at that time, didn't really have too much of a very high opinion of images like this. But nevertheless, if you look at Basile's work, Basile was very fascinated with the male body. I mean, if you look at his work overall, you can see that he had a strong attraction to the male body and a great deal of ability, I think, to actually depicting the male body. This is actually one of his academic studies depicting a male nude. And because of images like this, and this one, and this one, people have actually done a lot of speculation in regards to Bazile's sexual identity, because we don't know anything about that. When he died, he was actually a bachelor. He'd never married. His friendships with women, non-existent. His friendships with men actually much more well known than his relationships with women. But all of that's actually led to a lot of speculation about Bazile, and whether Bazile was actually gay, and whether this image is invested with a gay sensibility. Let's put it that way. And I think it is. I definitely think it is. And the reason I think that, or one of the reasons I actually think that, is because of quotes like this. This actually comes from a book written by E.M. Forster, a book titled Maurice. And Maurice is actually a book that was written in 1913, 1914. It's about a young man by the name of Maurice Hall, who's actually trying to come to terms with his sexual identity. And trials and tribulations he has as he does come to terms with his sexuality. According to Forster, I spelled his name wrong, unfortunately. According to Forster, this book was unpublishable in 1913, 1914. He didn't believe that it would ever be published. And the reason for that is just the subject matter, a young man's awakening to his own sexual identity. And another reason that Forster was convinced that it wouldn't ever be published was that it actually has a happy ending. And stories like that aren't supposed to have a happy ending. That's the whole point, or one of the whole points. Anyway, the book was eventually published in 1971. Anyway, there's a quote that comes out of that book that I like a great deal, and I think it's actually relevant to a lot of the images I'm talking about today. It says, look at that picture. A Youth by Michelangelo, for instance. I love it because, like the painter himself, I love the subject. I don't judge it with the eyes of a normal man. There seem to be two roads for arriving at beauty. One is common, and all the world has reached Michelangelo by it. But the other is private, to me and a few more. We come to him by both roads. These private roads are perhaps a mistake, concluded Clive, but as long as the human figure is painted, they will be taken. If you introduce the human figure, you at once arouse either disgust or desire. Very faintly sometimes, but it's there. And this actually took place as the quote actually comes from a period in the novel, or part of the novel, where Maurice Hall is actually wandering through a museum with Clive Durham, a young friend of his, and actually his very first love, let's put it that way. Anyway, like I said, I think it's actually a good quote because it suggests, well, it doesn't suggest, it indicates that when you look at things, there's actually two ways of looking at them. One through a rather common lens and one through an uncommon lens. That leads me to this work actually by Duncan Grant. Duncan Grant was actually an English artist associated with the Bloomsbury Group, and lived his life openly as a gay man, which I think is rather unusual given the time period. He was born in 1885 and he died in 1978. And he's living his life as an open gay man, not too awful long after the whole Oscar Wilde trial, where Oscar Wilde had actually been convicted for gross indecencies and imprisoned in Reading Gaol for a number of years. And with Wilde's imprisonment in Reading Gaol, homosexuality in England literally went underground. A good number of homosexuals that were actually living in England at that time actually left England. They actually went into a self-imposed exile. And those that remained behind hid in the shadows, went into the closet. But Duncan Grant refused to do that. Duncan Grant lived his life openly and unapologetically. And if you look at his career, he was actually drawn to the male nude and produced quite a few of them over the course of his career. And for our purposes today, I actually created several images of male bathers. And in these images of male bathers here, actually using, I guess you could say, a post-impressionist aesthetic to actually depict these men enjoying each other's company, again, along a body of water. And again, I think kind of in some ways kind of tampering down the eroticism just a little bit because of that reliance on that post-impressionist aesthetic here. Just a little bit. Another work by Grant, this one here titled Bathers, from around the same time period. Here he's actually using a color palette inspired by Paul Cézanne, brushwork inspired by Paul Cézanne, to depict a group of 9 men, 9 men, who are, again, bathing in a body of water underneath the bright sunlight. And here he's actually using his brushwork as a way to kind of draw a veil, I guess you could say, over portions of their body, and particularly their genitals. And again, in some ways, kind of tampering down just slightly the eroticism in the print, or in the painting. That leads me to this work here by Thomas Atkins, titled The Swimming Hole, from 1884 to 1885. Thomas Atkins actually was the very first American artist to ever study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And when Atkins was studying in Paris, he actually went to Paris in 1868 and studied until 1870. Anyway, while he was there, I'm convinced he saw Bazille's summer scene, The Bathers. I'm convinced of that. And I'm quite sure that this work was actually inspired by Bazille's painting. It's been described as the, how do I put this, most homoerotic painting in American art. That's the way it's actually been described, and actually by quite a few art historians. Again, I'm not quite convinced of that fact, only because of the way that it's actually painted. It's cloaked, that's maybe a nice word to describe it. It's kind of cloaked with a certain classical severity that again tends to kind of dampen the eroticism in this particular painting. If you look at it and look at the way that it's actually constructed, you can see that the figures are actually arranged in a triangle. And to me, they resemble figures you would see in a Greek pediment. You know, the sculptured figures you would see in a Greek pediment. And this figure here actually is drawn from classical antiquity. It's actually a depiction of the dying Gaul, a piece of Hellenistic sculpture, but actually seen in reverse. Seen in reverse. And then the figure that's actually at the apex of this pyramid here, this standing figure here, is actually, I think, borrowed from Donatello's David. It's very, very similar to Donatello's David, at least in his posture. Anyway, they create this pyramid, or this triangle here, and again, arranged in kind of a classical fashion. And Atkins, I think, has gone to great lengths to kind of disguise their genitals. He's actually turned them from the viewer in order to kind of, again, draw a veil over their genitals, and in a way, kind of tamping down that eroticism a little bit. This work was actually commissioned by a man by the name of Edward Coates, who was actually the chair of a commission on instruction at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, where Thomas Atkins was actually working at the time. And Coates actually commissioned this work for $800. That would actually be about $20,000 today. And what Coates wanted was a representative example of Atkins' work that could actually be displayed at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. And when Atkins actually presented this work to Coates, Coates rejected it. He rejected the work. And he didn't reject the work because of the nudity. That didn't bother him, because Coates himself had actually gone skinny dipping in the location that this painting is set. It's actually set at a place called Dove Lake, which is just outside of Philadelphia. Anyway, Coates' objection really wasn't to the nudity of the figures. What his objection was to the fact that he actually knew some of these men. some of these men were actually some of Atkins' students. And because they were Atkins' students, he found that actually quite troubling. And it's kind of an important little detail that Atkins actually depicts himself here. Atkins actually shows himself in the lower right-hand corner, actually swimming with his students, swimming in the nude with his students. And that's what Coates didn't like. Coates claimed that other people actually associated with the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, the directors, would actually have a problem with that. And they did. Just a few years earlier, the directors had actually cautioned Atkins to quit using his students as models. They thought that there was a problem with that. And so they told him he couldn't do that anymore. He didn't pay too much attention to that injuncture and continued to use his students as models as he did for this work here. And so that's why Coates rejected the work. He knew he knew the figures actually depicted here, and he knew the board of directors wouldn't go for it, because Atkins is actually breaking a rule, actually using his students as models, and even worse than that, swimming in the nude with them, and along with his pet dog, his red setter, whose name is Harry. Anyway, if you look at the painting, like I said, the painting to me seems, I can see where some people would describe it as homoerotic. I can agree with that. But again, he tends to kind of tampen that down just a little bit. I think that the studies that he created for the painting, though, I think those are actually much more erotic. And the reason for that is he actually depicts these men, or these young men, very realistically, very naturally. Their movements, their gestures strike you as very natural, very realistic, very spontaneous. And because of all of that, I think the photographs that actually served as studies for that particular painting, I think these are actually far more erotic than the painting itself. And nothing really quite prepares you for Charles Demuth. Charles Demuth was actually an American painter associated with the Stieglitz group in the early 20th century. And for the most part, Demuth led his life. Demuth was a homosexual. He was a gay man, and he lived his life very openly. That's one of the reasons that Stieglitz tended to distance himself from Demuth, was because of Demuth's sexuality, his sexual identity. But Charles Demuth created a couple of important watercolors on the theme of bathing. This is probably the most famous of them all, titled Turkish Bath with Self-Portrait from 1918. It actually depicts Demuth right here with a rather self-confident red-haired young man here who's standing there with his legs spread, his body more or less exposed to the viewer. And the viewer himself is actually, I would say, male. Just because of the location, we're actually at a Turkish bath. And the Turkish bath that we're thought to be at is actually the very notorious, what were called the Lafayette baths in New York City. Anyway, the viewer of this particular painting is a frequent visitor to the baths. And anyway, we're actually afforded a view of Demuth himself and some of his colleagues, and then also a very intimate moment taking place between two figures in the upper right-hand corner. Demuth actually gave this watercolor to a friend of his. This isn't the type of painting that was actually meant for public exhibition. This was the type of painting that was actually meant to be shared with Demuth's friends. Anyway, he ended up giving it to a friend of his, a man by the name of Darrell Larson. And Darrell Larson was actually a stage manager / teacher in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where Demuth was actually from. Anyway, when supposedly Larson actually kept this painting in a closet. He wouldn't hang it on his walls. He had to keep it in a closet because he was afraid of offending people that actually came over to his home. And so for many years, it spent its life sequestered away, hidden in a closet. And I don't know that you can actually find a more graphic depiction of same-sex attraction among men than Demuth's Three Sailors from 1917. A group of three sailors who've gone down to the beach in order to take a bath, maybe do a little bit of bathing as well. But it seems to me that there's other things on their mind here besides just bathing. But again, a work that was not meant for public exhibition, but meant to be shared amongst Demuth's friends. And I should mention a rather small little watercolor, too. Anyway, there were, I guess you could say, acceptable, what would be considered acceptable instances for depicting nude men bathing together. And things like this print ads for the Canon bath towels from the 1940s. And this one here, a print ad for Ivory soap from the 1940s. Enlisted men, men from the soldiers belonging to the Army, sailors belonging to the Navy, just enjoying a little bit of good, clean fun, despite the fact that that kind of ejaculatory nature of that hose suggests that there's something else going on here. It seems to me that when you come across images of single male bathers, a rather dramatic shift takes place. A dramatic shift in how we look at things, a dramatic shift takes place in seeing and feeling and experiencing single male bathers, which is really quite different from, again, images depicting groups of bathers. This is probably one of the most unusual for its time period. This is actually by a French painter by the name of Gustav Klimt, who lived his life as a single man, and there's actually quite a lot of debate over his sexual identity as well, and particularly due to paintings like this. This one actually is titled Man at His Bath from 1884, and it's really, I think, one of the most transgressive images of the 19th century. Think about this for just a minute. I think that the painting itself is very much influenced by Degas' images of bathers, very much. But if you have any familiarity with Degas' images of bathers, you generally have kind of an oblique view of the bather. You're kind of looking down on a woman, taking a bath in a tub, as though you're kind of maybe looking through a keyhole or something along those lines. With Klimt, he gives us something quite different. And I do believe this work was actually inspired by Degas' bathers. But he gives us actually something quite different. He actually places us in the very same room as this bather. And the space between us and the bather has actually collapsed quite a lot. We're actually brought into a very close proximity with this bather. Anyway, this man has just stepped out of the tub. You can still see his wet footprints here on the floor. And he's vigorously wiping his back, drying his back. And you can see that his legs are actually spread apart enough that you can actually see the scrotum between his legs, between his parted legs. And even more important than that, Klimt has actually placed the man's buttocks more or less right in the center of the composition. And the buttocks themselves are actually a locus. They're a locus of desire and penetration in same-sex activity among men. And so it's a very, I would say, very, very erotic image for the 19th century. Extremely erotic image for the 19th century. And the man is actually seen in his most vulnerable state, too, with his back to the viewer. And again, his buttocks placed right in the center of the composition. It's difficult to know what relationship this man would have had to Klimt. I speculate that it's actually one of his brothers, but I can't confirm that. Anyway, that when I started looking into Klimt's work a little bit more, and particularly this painting here, Man at His Bath, I came across the work of Henry Scott Tuke. And Henry Scott Tuke was an English painter. He actually painted maritime scenes, images of boats, sailboats in particular, and then quite a few paintings, actually, of young adolescent boys bathing. And that's really what Tuke is actually known for. Tuke led a rather discreet but open life as a gay man, and anyway, earned quite a good living for images like this. This one actually titled The Blue Jacket from 1910, kind of painted in a kind of quasi-impressionist style here, or impressionist aesthetic. And if you look at Tuke's work, again, he did quite a few of these. He goes out of his way to, again, kind of veil or hide the genitals of his models. And all of his models are about this age. And later in his life, when he wrote out his will, Tuke actually left a small inheritance to many of the young boys who actually served as his models. At that time, I guess, they 200 pounds inheritance. And he knew all of them, and he maintained his relationships with them. And a good many of his models actually went on to marry and have children themselves. That brings me back to Grant Wood's Sultry Night. Grant Wood, again, has turned the bather around and given us an honest and complete view of this bather as he takes that bucket and pours that water down the front of his body. And you can actually see that water actually traveling down his chest and actually falling just above his stomach. By the time Wood came to do this work, that's where I was going. By the time Wood came to do this work in 1937, he was actually well acquainted with images of male bathing. He'd actually done quite a few up until that point. This is one of them. It was actually an illustration for a book. This one actually titled Saturday Night Bath. And when I looked at this, I was wondering, okay, maybe Wood had actually seen Taibau's man at his bath, because they do have a rather striking similarity. It's quite possible that he could have. And then when I started researching it a little bit more, I found out that there was really no way that Grant Wood actually could have seen this work, because this work was actually exhibited in 1884, and it drew such bad criticism, it elicited such bad criticism, that Taibau never exhibited again. And it actually stayed in the family's collection until I think it was around 1967, when the family decided to sell it. And today it's actually in the collection of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Anyway, back to Grant Wood. Like I said, when I saw Saturday Night Bath, I thought, well, it's quite possible that he could have seen Taibau's work, but there's no way he could have, because it was in the family until 1967. He created another work a year later, this one here titled Saturday Night Bath, from 1937. It's a charcoal drawing, and everything in this drawing kind of directs the viewer's attention. And it directs the viewer's attention to the young man, at the right, who's actually shown taking his shirt off. You can see that there's actually two horses here, and both those horses are looking, or appear to be looking, directly at the young man here. The man standing here with the bucket, the direction of the bucket is actually leading our eye this way. The phallic horse trough that we see here, that's actually directing our attention this way. And then the discarded log or fence post that we see right here, that's also directing our attention to this young man. And if you look at the way that this picture is actually framed, the arch at the top actually rhymes with the opening up here at the top of the barn, suggesting that these two men, once they finish their bath, will actually head to the barn and to the loft in the barn, where they're actually going to spend the night. And so, in my opinion, it's again a very erotic image depicting two male bathers. According to R. Tripp Evans, who wrote a very good book about Grant Wood, according to him, in Sultry Night, the viewer is the other male bather. According to Tripp, this drawing here is kind of a warm-up exercise. He sees it as something of a warm-up exercise to this work here. And I think he's actually quite right about that. And I do like his idea that here, in this particular image, the viewer is the other bather, the other male bather. And again, think about the close proximity of the viewer to the man in the picture. The man is either very comfortable with our presence or oblivious to our presence, one or the other. I would say, given our close proximity to this man, he's very comfortable with our presence, not oblivious to it at all, but comfortable with it. When I think you need to spend just a few moments thinking about the title of that work, Sultry Night. Because anybody that's familiar with Grant Wood and Grant Wood's work, you know that he liked to play games sometimes with the titles of his work. American Gothic is maybe a very good example of that. But he titled this work Sultry Night. And I guarantee you that Grant Wood knew that sultry actually has two meanings. Sultry can mean or refer to something that is very hot and humid. The temperatures when it's burning hot. But sultry also has another meaning. It means hot with passion, or exciting or capable of exciting strong sexual desire. And so I think that when Grant Wood titled that work, Sultry Night, he did so intentionally. And I think that he actually was referencing the second definition for sultry, not the one actually referring to the climatic conditions, but this one here, referring to passion, or the ability to excite sexual desire. The night is actually thought to refer to this man, Eric Knight. Eric Knight was an English writer who was the author of Lassie Come Home. And Eric Knight and Grant Wood actually met each other in 1937. And Grant Wood actually invited Eric Knight to move into his home in Iowa City for the summer months, because Eric Knight was actually teaching a class at the University of Iowa in 1937, the summer of 1937. And so according to R. Tripp Evans, he speculates that Eric Knight actually served as the model for Sultry Night. And according to R. Tripp Evans, Sultry Night is, in Sultry Night, Grant Wood is actually, I guess you could say, conveying or representing the sexual attraction for Eric Knight. Or he could be, let's put it that way. He could be depicting or conveying his sexual attraction, the sexual attraction he had for Eric Knight. If they had a relationship, we have no knowledge of that fact. Eric Knight died the year after Grant Wood did. Grant Wood died in 1942 from pancreatic cancer, and Eric Knight actually died in a plane crash in Suriname in 1943. About the same time that Grant Wood was working on the print, Sultry Night, he was at work on a painting titled Sultry Night too. And Sultry Night, according to Grant Wood, was very similar in its composition to this print, very, very similar. And a man by the name of Homer St. Gaudens, who was actually the director of the Carnegie Institute in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, St. Gaudens actually contacted Wood and asked him for a painting that he could actually use in an international exhibition that the Carnegie Institute would actually be staging in, I think it was November of 1938. And he wanted a late work by Wood. He wanted one of Wood's late works, one of the works that Wood had just finished completing. And Wood wrote back Homer St. Gaudens, and he said that he'd just finished Sultry Night, a painting titled Sultry Night, and he would actually be sending him that work. And according to Grant Wood, it was actually one of the best paintings that he had done in recent years. He was actually quite happy with the work. Anyway, Wood boxed up the painting. He actually sent it to Homer St. Gaudens. And then Homer St. Gaudens actually wrote back to Grant Wood, thanking him for the work and telling him that he couldn't use it. He couldn't use it in the exhibition. And he couldn't use it in the exhibition because of the male nude. Supposedly, according to Homer St. Gaudens, the previous year, they'd actually had an exhibition with a male nude in it, and it elicited a certain amount of controversy, and because of all of that, the directors, the people that Homer St. Gaudens actually answered to, let's say rejected Grant Wood's work. And so Grant Wood, Homer St. Gaudens actually got hold of Grant Wood and told him that the director's decision, and asked Grant Wood if he would send him something else. And Wood did. Wood ended up sending him this painting, a portrait of his mother, titled Woman with Plants from 1929. So that could be used in that exhibition at the Carnegie Institute. And so the Carnegie Institute actually sent this painting back to Wood, and according to R. Tripp Evans, Wood actually took the canvas, sawed off the portion depicting the male nude, tweaked the landscape actually quite a lot, introduced two bulls to the right-hand side of the composition. But anyway, severed the painting, cut the painting, I'd say cut off about a third of the painting. And then it all depends on who you read as far as what happened to that depiction of the male nude. According to reports of the day, Grant Wood supposedly burned it. He cut it off and then burned that portion of it. But it was, there's other people that believe that that portion of the painting might still exist, but if it does, it hasn't been discovered yet. One thing I forgot to mention that I think is kind of important, shortly after Wood finished this work, he actually invited a group of people to his home for a cocktail party, both men and women, and to actually exhibit the work, to actually show them the work for the first time. And anyway, when he unveiled the work to his invited guests, supposedly most of them were actually taken aback by it. According to a man who actually attended that cocktail party where that painting was actually exhibited, claimed that it was actually the men in the audience that were more uncomfortable with the male nude than the women who actually were at the cocktail party. The men were actually more offended by the male nudity than the women that were there. And so, like I said, he ends up sending it to the Carnegie Institute shortly after that cocktail party. They end up rejecting the work. And I think because of the controversy that the print itself encountered in 1937, and then the pushback that he got from the Carnegie Institute after sending the painting there, he decided to just commit an act of self-censorship and saw off half the painting and supposedly burn it. And you can tell that there was actually more to the painting, because if you actually look at the frame, you can see that it actually had an arched top to it, much like that charcoal drawing. An arched top, very similar to the art drawing. But he ended up cutting it off, and again, only a portion of that remains today. Anyway, I guess you could say this act of self-censorship that Wood undertook in mutilating one of his own canvases suggests that only certain things are possible at certain times. That's one of the, it's a good indication that only certain things are possible at certain times. I wonder if Wood were alive today and he created this image today, if it would have been any more accepted today than it was in 1937 or 1938. Hard to know for sure. Anyway, that's all I have. I have about 15 or 20 minutes for questions if you have any.
It's not really a question, it's just a comment. Grant Wood also cut off the bottom of the appraisal, and a portion of that has been found. If you want to see it, it's in the Demuth Museum of Art. So, you know, he did have a history of cutting off, and some of it has been found.
Grant Wood was not the very first artist to censor their own work.
When you were talking about the double meaning of sultry, you referred to the 2018 Merriam-Webster dictionary. It would be interesting to know what the 1931 dictionary had to say about sultry. I know that the edition in the 1930s did not contain the word homosexual.
Reed said he brought up a good point.
Grant Wood supposedly spent several trips going over to Germany, to Berlin. At the time, Cabaret was a big hit, and I'm guessing that he saw Cabaret. Do you think that led him to become more experimental, a little braver in his outlook on life, and then came back to Iowa and was rather depressed about it all?
It's possible. for actually arranging late night skinny dipping parties with young men in Cedar Rapids. And so maybe, yeah, maybe he did become a little bit more open after his trip to Europe.
I don't know if you have time to talk about the sexuality and the nude paintings in other cultures. But I just, I'm from Korea originally, and I'm not an artist. But so I cannot say I have seen all the paintings. However, the paintings I have seen, like Korean and Chinese and Japanese, especially Japanese, there's the sexual paintings. However, men and women, they are all wearing clothes. You expose all the anatomical sexual part, but they are wearing clothes.
The Asian cultures have a different relationship to the body, I think, than Westerners do. And I think because of that different relationship to the body, because of that different relationship to the body, images of the body and depictions of the body are kind of interpreted maybe a little bit different. I'm trying to think, what's the name of that Japanese woodblock prints? Shunga. Shunga is actually quite erotic, Shunga prints. And so there's actually acceptance for that, I think you could say, in Asian cultures, where not so much in the West. Does that answer your question, or is it a comment? Well, if you're not familiar with Shunga prints, Google them, and you'll see what I mean. They're much more open in regards to their sexuality than Westerners are. And there are reasons for that.
Just wondering if you might speculate on why depictions of male nudity from antiquity might be more acceptable to modern audiences rather than more modern depictions?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It all depends on the art from antiquity that you're actually looking at. If you're actually looking at Greek sculpture or Roman sculpture, they tend to shrink male genitals, and they shrink them in such a way that they become acceptable, I guess you could say. But if you really spend much time looking at Greek art and look at something like Greek ceramics are actually much more erotic. Much more erotic. But again, when it comes to studying that kind of material, in the classroom in particular, you're introduced to the sculpture, where they, again, kind of play down the eroticism of the body and totally ignore things like ceramics that depict that heightened sense of sexual activity and sexuality. It's kind of interesting if you really stop and think about it. Like as far as books published on Greek art or antique art, again, they're going to focus more on the sculpture than they are the ceramic ware. And a lot of it's just due to the erotic nature of some of that ceramic ware. And the same with the Romans, too. Romans actually created a lot of erotic art, an incredible amount of erotic art that never gets talked about. You have to really be a specialist in that field, I think, to have much familiarity with it. Good question. Anyone else?
All right, Reed, thank you so much for your beautiful lecture.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Thank you all for coming in.